Thank you all so much for coming. This is a real fantastic opportunity for me. As Deepak was saying, this is just around the corner from where I grew up, and a lot of my family are around here. So it is an amazing opportunity to sort of come back from Oxford and speak for the first time near where I grew up. And thank you all for coming. I didn't really know much about the Friends of the OCHS here in Leicester, and so it's great to see this group. So the title of my talk is The Infinite Mirror, How Vasiṣṭha's Stories Offer a Taste of Liberation. And hopefully through the course of this talk, it'll become more clear why exactly I chose this title. So basically what I'm going to present here is, in 45 minutes, a sort of overview of one of the kind of central arguments I make in my PhD thesis, which I'm working on at the moment, hopefully coming near the end. And my PhD thesis is entitled The Transformative Philosophy of the Mokṣopāya. And so the Mokṣopāya is the text that I work on, and I will say a little bit about it in a second. But my PhD thesis looks at the Mokṣopāya in light of, it's a very sort of specific claim, an idea that became popular in around the 9th century in Kashmir, right? And so this idea is that poetry, so man-made works of poetry or drama, man-made works of art, can not just communicate sort of mundane emotions, sort of the kind of classic emotions of longing, of desire, of anger, of heroism, like sort of lots of classic works of art might communicate. But works of art can communicate a taste of liberation itself. So this is a concept that is sort of orbits around the Sanskrit term genre-rasa, or the taste of tranquility. And this idea was that poetry, written by the right people, designed in the right way, can give a taste of liberation. And so my PhD thesis looks at this text, the Mokṣopāya, but it looks at this text in light of this idea that the Mokṣopāya, this text, was maybe designed to give a taste of liberation. And so then my PhD tries to argue that that is an essential part of the Mokṣopāya and then explains how that works. So yeah, hopefully by the end of this talk, we'll have a bit of a sense of what that might look like. So just to very briefly give an overview of what is to come. First, I'll introduce the Mokṣopāya, say a bit about this text, say what it talks about, what it contains. Then I'll look at this claim that the Mokṣopāya makes, that it's not just telling the reader about liberation, but it actually, if the reader reflects on the text in the right way, the text can actually lead to liberation. So the text actually does something, it doesn't just say something. And so I look at that claim. And then I look at a story from the Mokṣopāya so to give a sense of what this text is about. And this is a story of the 100 Shivas, or the 100 Rudras, which I think is probably the most characteristic story of the text, and it's quite exciting. And then I look at the philosophical implications of this story. And then, in the end, I'll see how some of those philosophical implications, the philosophy that the text creates, which is a philosophy of infinity, as we'll see, gives, hopefully, the reader a sense of liberation. So let's start by talking a little bit about the Mokṣopāya. So this is an epic poem. It's a huge epic poem, a humongous poem, almost 30,000 verses, that was written in the 10th century in Kashmir, at this time of profound intellectual production in medieval Kashmir, where there was great leaps forward in poetry, in aesthetic criticism, in philosophy, across a range of different philosophical schools, various schools of Hinduism, various schools of Buddhism. And now this text is the oldest available version of a text more commonly known in India today as the Yoga-Vasiṣṭha, and maybe some people have heard of the Yoga-Vasiṣṭha, maybe not. But just recently, a 25-year textual studies project has been finished by a team of German scholars who've been working away at this text for 25 years, and they've done a couple of different things. So the first thing that they've done is they've proved that the Mokṣopāya, which is the text that I work on, is the oldest version of this text more commonly known as the Yoga-Vasiṣṭha. So the Yoga-Vasiṣṭha came later and was sort of edited in some sort of interesting ways. But the earliest version that we have available is the Mokṣopāya. And then they took a load of manuscripts from around India, and they collated those manuscripts and then put together a definitive version, what's called a critical edition. And that was just finished. It was just published this year, actually. So it's allowed the text to be sort of available for a new wave of scholarship. And my PhD, I see as sort of sitting in that new wave. And the contents of the text is really interesting. So the content of the text describes this dialogue between Rama, who is the Rama of the Ramayana, and the sage Vasiṣṭha. So let me say a little bit about the main contents of the text. So it's set before the events of the classic Ramayana, when Rama is just a boy. And it begins with young Rama asking his father Dasharatha for permission to go on a tirth, on a pilgrimage. And he goes on this pilgrimage. And after he returns, Rama is sort of completely depressed. He's not speaking, he's sort of staring into space, he's sitting in the full lotus position, he's not doing his kingly duties, and he's not really talking to anybody. Sort of maybe a moment of a teenage existential crisis or something. And then his father eventually gets him to speak and asks him, what has happened to you? And Rama then launches into this sort of long monologue, this long tirade, describing how he went on this pilgrimage and he saw the truth of the world, which is that desires lead to suffering. All desires lead to suffering. That our attempts at finding happiness in the world all lead to failure. Everybody is running around, trying to be happy, but nobody is happy. And so he now feels that life is not worth living. And importantly, he's refusing to carry out his kingly duties. And so this is a problem. It's a problem for Dasharatha, his father. But in the court, the sage Vishwamitra sees Rama, and instead of trying to beat this attitude out of him, he says, Rama has actually reached the stage of Vairagya. He's reached the stage of renunciation. He's actually close to full liberation. All he needs is some instruction on the nature of reality and the nature of Jivan Mukti, of liberation in life, and then he'll reach the highest state. So Vishwamitra summons the sage Vasiṣṭha, he's a famous Vedic rishi, he's part of the court of Dasharatha. And he summons him to give instruction to Rama on the nature of reality. And it's the way that Vasiṣṭha gives instruction to Rama in this text that gives the Mokṣopāya its characteristic flavor, right? So rather than just sort of speaking very explicitly, Vasiṣṭha speaks in terms of philosophy. He gives a lot of philosophical arguments. He describes the nature of the world, but he also tells these very fantastical stories. Lots of very creative, intricate stories that we don't actually see anywhere else in the history of Indian literature. So these are stories that are created by the author of the Mokṣopāya. And they're really interesting because they're sort of reminiscent of sci-fi in a way, or perhaps like modernist, postmodernist literary developments and things like this. And we'll get a sense of this when we look at the story. So let's move on to a concept in the Mokṣopāya, or Jivan Mukti. And have people heard of this idea, Jivan Mukti? People understand that this is a term that refers to liberation, mukti, in life while living, right? So this is a term that's referred to in the Upanishads, it's referred to in the writings of Shankara, Advaita Vedanta. But it isn't really developed in detail until later on. The first Advaita Vedanta writer to look in detail at the concept of Jivan Mukti is a guy called Vidyaranya, who's writing around the 14th century. I think, or maybe 13th century. But he actually himself draws on the Mokṣopāya. So there's been a scholarly argument that actually Jivan Mukti as a concept is first fully developed in the Mokṣopāya, right? And so just to give a sense of how the Mokṣopāya thinks of Jivan Mukti, how Vasiṣṭha's teachings in the Mokṣopāya conceive of Jivan Mukti, I have a quote here, and I'll read it to you. So this is from book 3 of the Mokṣopāya, and it's Vasiṣṭha describing the Jivan Mukta, the person who has attained Jivan Mukti. So he says that he for whom this world, though still appearing as it is, and though he remains engaged in worldly activity, has nonetheless vanished and exists as empty space, he is called a Jivan Mukta. He who has become grounded in awareness alone, who is awake as if he were in deep sleep, the doer of activities who rests, he is called a Jivan Mukta. He whose facial expressions does not rise or fall in pleasure or pain, whose condition is in accordance with the circumstances, he is called a Jivan Mukta. He who is awake in deep sleep and who is not awake, whose awareness is without karmic traces or vasanas, he is called a Jivan Mukta. So if we want to study the concept of Jivan Mukti in the Mokṣopāya, one strategy might be to take a lot of passages like this throughout the Mokṣopāya and compare them with each other and compare them with other passages that describe Jivan Mukti in other texts. And then we can get a sense of what is original about the way the Mokṣopāya describes Jivan Mukti. But there's also another aspect of Jivan Mukti in the Mokṣopāya that becomes clear when we see that the text isn't just trying to describe Jivan Mukti, but it's actually trying to give Jivan Mukti to the reader, which is, I think, what makes the Mokṣopāya sort of characteristically different from a lot of other philosophical texts of the time. Right? So we can see this in these passages and many others, but let me read these out. So the Mokṣopāya says, a person whose mind is pure through the knowledge granted by the Mokṣopāya. So this is the Mokṣopāya talking about itself here. He is not depressed by the flood of enjoyments, nor does it ever delight him. He sees the multitudes of creations that rise and fall unhindered in each of the smallest atoms. And so this multitudes of creations actually will become interesting later on. And we also hear that when one has understood this whole Shastra, so this text, this Mokṣopāya, either having read it aloud or examined it, this Jivan Mukti is always experienced, but this Shastra is not spoken like a wish or a curse. So if we take passages like this seriously, we can see that there were actually two aspects of Jivan Mukti in the Mokṣopāya, right? One aspect of Jivan Mukti is what I call a text-internal aspect of Jivan Mukti, right? Which is when we see the text as containing a particular concept and it's connected in various ways to other concepts in its sort of intellectual world. But another aspect shows up when we see that Jivan Mukti wasn't just an abstract concept that this philosopher was talking about. He actually envisioned it as a real possibility for the reader, as something that the text could actually create, right? And this latter aspect isn't just about what the text says, it's about what the text does. And it can't really be brought, is my argument in my thesis, it can't really be brought into view by sort of the classic textual analysis, the kind of things that the German scholars have been doing, right? So this is my way of trying to say that my study is important, my study is unique. And the way I see it is you can imagine sort of two different types of book, right? You can imagine a psychology textbook that talks about grief, and it talks about the causes of grief, the symptoms of grief, the features of grief. And then you can imagine another book, a novel, that doesn't just describe grief, but gives you a sense of what grief is actually like, right? So I see that the Mokṣopāya is in a way trying to do what the latter is doing, what the novel is doing, but for Jivan Mukti. So because of this, we need a bit of a more creative analysis of the text. And the question becomes how the text seeks to give the reader liberation. So to give a sense of this, we're going to go into... Oh, my image isn't coming up here. It's coming up on my screen, but not on the projector. I think it's just because it's dark, but that's okay. There's an image of Shiva and a monk here, you have to imagine. So we'll go a little bit into one of the stories. And so this is the story of the 100 Shivas or the 100 Rudras. Rudra is just another name for Shiva. And it comes sort of halfway in the Mokṣopāya. And to me, it's one of the most sort of characteristic tales. It gives you a sense of the kinds of stories that Vasiṣṭha is telling Rama in this book. So it's a long story, and there's lots of different aspects to it. I have a long translation of it in my PhD, but here I will read the beginning of the story, and then I'll sort of summarize it briefly. This is a translation that I've done, so it's a little bit, because the Sanskrit I've translated the Sanskrit quite literally here. It sounds a little clunky, but I'll read this out. So this is a tale that Vasiṣṭha is telling Rama. Right? So let me read it from here. Listen, O Rama, to this tale I now recount. An account of what once befell a certain Buddhist monk. So this is a Buddhist monk being referred to in this text, right? Devoted to reflection. There was a certain great monk who, wholly absorbed in the practice of meditation, who passed every day constantly immersed in his own routine. His mind, purified through the continuous practice of meditation, would instantly become whatever it thought of, like water becomes a wave. One day, when he had concluded his meditative absorption and remained one pointed in mind, he began to contemplate, while seated in his usual posture, the sequence of his practices. So as he was thinking, a thought arose spontaneously. Let me imagine, just for the sake of play, the life of an ordinary man. And with that thought, another man arose in his mind, through the abandonment of the form of its, i.e., of the mind's previous vibration, like water in a whirlpool. And that mind man, Chittanara, moved by a desire within himself, suddenly conceived a name, I am Jivata, like a chance fall of a coconut that coincides with a crow's landing. This is this term, Kakadaliyavat, which is a sort of common epithet in Sanskrit, meaning something that just happens coincidentally. So Jivata, the dream man, wandered for a long time through the markets of a city, fashioned in a dream. There he drank liquor and became intoxicated, like a bee drunk on lotus nectar. Crushed as if by a stone, he fell into a deep, dreaming sleep. So, this is the beginning of the story, and we can see here that Vasiṣṭha tells Rama about a certain Buddhist monk whose mind was purified by his daily practices. And one day he sort of gets distracted in his meditation and he says, let me imagine, just for the sake of it, just for play, just for fun, let me imagine the life of an ordinary man. And so then he creates this sort of mind world, this dream world in his mind. And in that world he's named Jivata. There's a man called Jivata. And this imagined man, Jivata, wanders around in his own world and one day enters a liquor shop and falls asleep drunk. And then the story continues, and I have some photos here that sort of show the story, but none of these photos are coming up. So I'll have to just tell you about it. So what happens is Jivata himself, when he falls asleep, he dreams himself to be a Brahmin who is said in the story to sort of love reciting the Vedas, to be sort of obsessed with recitation. And one day this Brahmin himself falls asleep and imagines that he's a lord, a samanta, a sort of chieftain. And then this cycle continues. So this begins a series of dreams within dreams, in which a number of different dream characters dream other dream characters. And so we see this cycle continue 100 times, right? This is the story of the 100 Rudras, right? So we see a goddess, a doe, a vine, so a plant, and a bee, an elephant. There's all sorts of different creatures that arise in this series of dreams within dreams. And eventually, a Hamsa bird is dreamt. And this is the Hamsa of Brahma. This is a sort of divine Hamsa bird. Again, I have some images here. But these are actually just images that I made on ChatGPT to try and describe this story. So it's not a big deal that they're not showing up. But this Hamsa bird, so we go at this stage where there's all these dreams within dreams, and this Hamsa bird at some point is dreamt. And this Hamsa bird then sees Shiva, and his mind becomes Shiva. And so within this cycle of dreams within dreams, eventually Shiva is dreamt. And what's interesting about Shiva is that Shiva is a god, and so he's omniscient, and he's able to marvel at the illusory series of dreams within dreams that eventually led to his own creation. He's able, in a way, to look back through all of these different dreams, to see how he arose. And upon Shiva's realization, he decides not to destroy this magical illusion that gave birth to him, but he actually decides to fly and visit the different worlds by flying through space, through the space of the mind, through the space of consciousness. And so he first flies to the monk's world and wakes him up, and then he flies with him to Jivata's world and wakes Jivata up. And so then we have this moment in the story where the three characters, we have the monk, we have Jivata, and we have Shiva, all standing for a moment, gazing at each other in silent astonishment. And I have a ChatGPT image here. Or you can see two of the characters there, and then Shiva in the middle, with sort of the dark skin is maybe appropriate there. Just the eyes, which is interesting. Oh, and you can see, the crescent moon in his hair there. Exactly. So we have this moment where they're all looking at each other. And then eventually all the characters are awoken, so all of the different 100 dream characters are awoken, and they're sent to live out their lives in their own samsaras. So even though they're aware of how they came to be, that they are just imaginations, they're sent to go live out the rest of their lives. And then Vasiṣṭha says to Rama at the end that actually this Shiva that I've been telling you about, he's actually only one of 11 Shivas that exist in the universe. And that at the end of the story, Rama asks Vasiṣṭha, what have we got here? Oh, we can see this one, here we go. Rama asks Vasiṣṭha, well, is this just a story that you've made up, or is this monk actually real? And Vasiṣṭha interestingly says he doesn't know. Vasiṣṭha doesn't answer Rama, but he says that tonight I will enter meditation and I will fly around the universe. And then I will see if this story is actually true or not. And so Vasiṣṭha does that, and he enters meditation, he flies around the universe, and he can't find the monk initially, but eventually he goes to China. It's described in this text. Interestingly, written in 10th century Kashmir, it's described that he goes to China, he goes to China. And he goes to a Buddhist monastery, and he finds the exact same monk in his story. So this is an image from ChatGPT of Vasiṣṭha finding this monk in a cell. So this is the story of the 100 Rudras, sort of hopefully giving you a sense of what kind of text the Mokṣopāya is, what kinds of fantastical sort of sci-fi-esque worlds that it builds. So, as I said, we'll come to the question of what are the philosophical implications of this story. What kind of philosophical vision of the world does it build? So this is a lot of what I focus on in my PhD dissertation. And so one implication, we might say, is that this gives us a sense of how the Mokṣopāya's philosophy is idealist, right? And so idealism is this idea that rather than the world being made of matter rather than the world being made of physical stuff. The world is in some way made of mind, whether that is the individual mind or whether that is some sort of universal mind, whether that's pure consciousness, right? And so in the context of the Mokṣopāya, in the context of the 10th century, there were three big schools of idealism, three different philosophical schools, all arguing for idealism but in different ways, right? So one of these is Advaita Vedanta, which is, I think, more commonly known, perhaps, to people. This is the school, famous school, one of the three main schools of Vedanta, which interpret the Upanishads, sort of systematized most famously by Shankaracharya in the 9th century, and the 8th century, I think, 9th century actually. And in Advaita Vedanta, the world is just an appearance within pure consciousness. So the real reality is just pure consciousness, and every thing that we take to be external to consciousness or we take to be made of physical matter actually just appears within consciousness itself. And so that's one idealistic school. Another idealistic school is idealistic Buddhism, which is often referred to as Vijnanavada Buddhism. And this actually was really flourishing in medieval Kashmir. A lot of the prominent philosophers of the time were philosophers in this tradition. And this tradition is a tradition of Buddhism, but it's an idealistic sort of interpretation of the Buddhist teachings. So the idea is that rather than the world being created by sort of universal consciousness, the apparently external world, so the world that we see that seems to be external to the mind, is actually a production of the mind that is conceived of as this constantly changing, constantly flowing stream that's made up of experiences and memories and impressions. So the mind is like a river. It's constantly changing, made up of all of these different parts. And this mind projects this world like a sort of magical show. And so this was the kind of philosophy, it's a sense of the kind of philosophical worldview of idealistic Buddhism. And the third contender, also influential in Mokṣopāya, is non-dual Shaivism. So this is what's often referred to as Kashmiri Shaivism, which is sort of becoming more widely known today. And so Kashmiri Shaivism, a lot like Advaita Vedanta, thinks that the world is an appearance within the one pure consciousness. There's only one consciousness, there's only one great mind, and it produces the world. But the difference from Advaita Vedanta is that in Kashmiri Shaivism, consciousness isn't just pure and it isn't just perfectly still, like a still lake. But consciousness itself is identical with Shiva, with the god Shiva. And Shiva has a sort of passive side, but Shiva also has an active side. So for the monistic Shaivas, for the idealistic Shaivas, consciousness itself is active. They use this word spanda, or vibration, a lot. So consciousness has intrinsic to it this ability to vibrate and create the world. So this is sort of different from mainstream Advaita Vedanta. So we have these three different schools, and we can see that the Mokṣopāya is definitely influenced by these. We can see in the story that all of the different imagined worlds that are created are, according to the story, as real as any word that we might conceive of. We see that they're as real as the monk's world. And then at the end of the story, the epilogue sort of emphasizes this, right? Rama asks Vasiṣṭha, well, maybe you just made this story up. Maybe this is just something in your imagination. And then Vasiṣṭha goes and he finds the actual world of the monk. So the kind of world of pure imagination that is conceived of in the story is then transposed into the world of Rama and Vasiṣṭha. So it's the story trying to, it's in a way impressing on Rama that this picture of the world that the story develops, that nothing outside of imagination exists, that everything is just a project of imagination, is then impressed on Rama as being real in some way. And so this is expressed here when Shiva realizes that how he came to be. He says, what a marvel this illusion is. A whole world of illusion, though false, it appears real, like a distinctly appearing mirage in the desert, right? So we have a worldview in which nothing appears outside of consciousness. And as Shiva describes it, these things that appear in consciousness are just illusions. They're like magic tricks, right? But all of these different idealistic schools that I have described have to face a question, right? So they all agree that, well, the world that appears to be external to the mind isn't actually external to the mind. But then they need to have an explanation for why the appearances appear in the way that they do, right? If you're a physicalist, if you believe in matter, then you can say, well, you have these appearances in consciousness because I'm perceiving this world that really exists out there. If there's no world that exists out there, then you have to have an explanation of why it appears that there is. And so here we can see then, if we ask this question, how the Mokṣopāya is different from these other idealistic schools that are influential upon the text. So one of the first ways we can see this difference is by seeing that illusions in the Mokṣopāya arise without a cause. Right? So I described a little bit about idealistic Buddhism. And in this philosophical school, the reason that illusions arise is ultimately because of causation. Right? The way that these philosophers conceive of the mind as working is that we have experiences, and these experiences then implant memories in our mind stream. And these memories then, they ripen, they ripen eventually, and they create more experiences. So you have this series of cause and effect of memories creating experiences, creating memories, creating experiences that gives rise to the world. And then you might ask, well, when did this series begin? And the Buddhist will say it never began. That this just goes back into beginningless time. And it only ends upon liberation. So the Buddha is then liberated, he cleans his mind is cleaned of all memory traces, and then his perception actually vanishes. So for the Buddhist, it's cause and effect ultimately that produces illusions within consciousness. The same is actually true of Shankara's Advaita Vedanta in a different way. I mean, the tradition of Advaita Vedanta was interestingly influenced by Buddhism in many ways. But Shankara has this notion of superimposition of the adhyasa to explain why pure consciousness that has no objects intrinsic to it appears to have, why objects appear within consciousness. And he has this idea of superimposition, which I won't really get into here. It's a sort of fascinating concept. But at the beginning of his commentary on the Brahma Sutras, his bhashya on the Brahma Sutras, he says that superimposition basically works like memory. And there's many places in Shankara's writings where he suggests that the reason that appearances arise in consciousness is because of memory, it's because of cause and effect. Ultimately, this is karma. So it's because we've had previous experiences and those previous experiences leave a trace. That is the reason that new experiences arise. And similarly for Shankara, these go back into beginningless time. But for the Mokṣopāya, we see something different. And this is suggested at many different places in the text. But here in this story, I think we see it at the beginning in the passage that I just read out, right? So we see that the monk was sitting there, and he's described as a monk whose mind is purified in some way. But then we see that this thought arose spontaneously, svataha. And so it seems to suggest that illusions can arise in consciousness without a prior cause. And now this is actually, the fact that illusions arise in consciousness without a prior cause is said very explicitly throughout the text. But here, just in this story, I think this is the moment where this author is making this worldview clear, right? And it's interesting because I think the text does it in a sort of playful narrative way. There's something really interesting about a story of a Buddhist monk who dreams himself to be Shiva. This image would have been very sort of mocking, I think, to an orthodox Buddhist who would have thought that, well, a pious monk wouldn't get distracted in his meditation in this way. So I think this is the Mokṣopāya sort of using narrative to try and sort of poke fun at this Buddhist doctrine. So this is implication 2. Now let's move on to implication 3. And this is where we see that the Mokṣopāya is distinct from Kashmir Shaivism. So Kashmir Shaivism, as I indicated, thinks that consciousness is identical to Shiva, to the god Shiva. And so for the Kashmiri Shaivas, it's not ultimately cause and effect that gives rise to the world as it appears. It's ultimately the will of Shiva. Because consciousness is identical with God, and God is a person, so God has will. God can decide. God determines the world to appear. God might determine the world appears with cause and effect, but ultimately it's his will. It's his will that determines why appearances arise in the way that they do. But we see something interesting in the story of the 100 Shivas. We see that we have this story of this Buddhist monk who dreams himself to be Shiva. And so in some ways, he's like Shiva is a dream of the monk. But then at other points in the story, it seems to suggest that Shiva, in a way, contains all of the different dream characters, that Shiva is the lord of all the dream characters. In a way, perhaps Shiva himself dreams all the dream characters. So there's this sort of interesting sort of dynamic in the Mokṣopāya story, in the story of the 100 Rudras, where it seems that in one level, Shiva is a dream of the monk, but also that the monk is a dream of Shiva. And then but if we want to go further and take a more sort of Shaiva theological interpretation, we might say, well, all of these different dream characters just arise ultimately because of Shiva in some way. But then the epilogue of the story sort of pushes back against this. When we might think this, we hear that Vasiṣṭha says, actually, this Shiva is only one of 11 different Shivas that exist in the universe, right? So to me, we see here the Mokṣopāya's very unique take on the question of sort of God and theology, right? Shiva appears as the final dream of the monk, but in some way himself seems to contain all the dream characters. So to me, it seems that the Mokṣopāya doesn't have a problem with this very classical Hindu mythological idea that God dreams the world. We find this kind of image in the Puranas, we find it across Hindu mythology. But the Mokṣopāya does something interesting. It, in a way, goes further and says that, well, we can accept that God dreams the world, but only if God himself is the dream of someone else. As I interpret it, the Mokṣopāya takes the model of individual selves as dreams of a divine self. But it extends this infinitely into an infinite regress of dreams. So all of us now are, and including God himself, are dreams in the mind of another, in layers of dreams within dreams that never bottoms out. So this is the sort of radical worldview that the Mokṣopāya is painting. Everything exists within consciousness, but it's not the consciousness of any particular individual. Different individuals arise within consciousness, but they're always in some way dreams of someone else. This infinite layer of dreams within dreams is the world that the Mokṣopāya is painting. So here again, two photos, but we'll skip over that. So we've seen how the Mokṣopāya is different from other idealistic philosophies, but what is its answer to why appearances arise within consciousness? So I think that this only really becomes clear towards the end of the text. I think the text paints a lot of different worlds through its stories, but then reaches a sort of narrative climax in one of the last stories of the text, which I won't go into in detail because it's very long and complicated. But there's a certain passage from this text, from this story, that I will read. So we hear one day Vasiṣṭha was flying through the space of consciousness, so he was flying through the universe, and he's reporting to Rama what he sees. And so this is just a short extract from this long passage, but let me read it to you. So this is Vasiṣṭha speaking. As numerous as the host of triple worlds and the hundreds of cycles of rebirths, I perceive the appearance of countless worlds. Like dreams of people who are asleep at the same time, these great activities are unseen by one another and empty of one another. Some are empty, some are filled with elements. Some are made of the 5 elements. Some only have 1 element like earth, some have 4 elements such as earth and the rest. Others have 3 elements like earth, others have 2. Others have 7 great elements, and others are made of a single type of element. Some are opposed to the world of your experience, others are of the same kind. Some are always dark, and others are devoid of the sun and other lights. Some last for brief eons, I think the word kalpa here. Others last for long eons. Some are a disordered mass, others are an ordered mass. So this passage is fascinating. What is implied is that there is an infinity of worlds that appear within consciousness. And what is particularly interesting is this last verse here. Like some are disordered and some are ordered, right? So it seems that these worlds that appear in consciousness are not even constrained by the laws of nature. The apparent laws of nature in their necessity are actually random appearances within an ocean of possibilities that stretches out infinitely in all directions. So actually what I argue is being, we have another image here. So what I argue is being suggested in this passage, and others like it, is that the universe of the Mokṣopāya is so big, so all-encompassing, that it actually contains all possibilities. It is not just a universe in which a huge variety of different things happen, but is one in which all things happen. Every imagined possibility actually happens somewhere in the infinite space of consciousness. All apparent phenomena and apparent order, apparent regularity, apparent consistency, the apparent laws of nature, don't arise because of fixed laws of causality, nor do they arise because of the will of a divine person, but actually they are simply the random appearances within an infinite set of possibilities. So the way that I describe this in my thesis is using this analogy of the monkey with a typewriter, right? Which is a famous thought experiment that suggests that if we have enough monkeys with enough time and give them more typewriters, they will type out enough letters, and eventually one monkey will type out the entire works of Shakespeare, right? So I think, interestingly, the Mokṣopāya paints a picture of the universe that makes an analogous use of infinity, but it uses that infinity to explain the order and consistency of the phenomena that we see in front of us. So where other idealistic schools will resort to something like a will or something like cause and effect, the Mokṣopāya resorts to infinity itself as the explanation for why the world appears in the way that it does, right? But the big difference with the monkey and the typewriter image is that where the monkeys are randomly arranging keys, arranging letters, the worlds of the Mokṣopāya are randomly arranging the imagination. So we should think of a vast universe of randomly arranged, we shouldn't think of a vast universe of randomly arranged atoms. Rather, we should think of an infinite universe in which all imagined possibilities exist simultaneously, like patterns of light in a great crystal, or perhaps like an infinite mirror. The Mokṣopāya uses this analogy of consciousness as a mirror and says that the apparent phenomena appear in consciousness like reflections in a mirror. But what we need to do to understand the Mokṣopāya's philosophy is an infinite mirror that isn't reflecting anything outside of it, but actually contains all possible reflections. And so this comes out in some of the metaphors of the Mokṣopāya. And I don't have much time left, so I won't read both of these. But this first one, I think, is particularly interesting, right? So this is a verse from Book 3. It says that just like an uncarved figure resides in a pillar, in the same way the whole world exists. For this reason, reality is not empty. And in this image, the pillar itself is consciousness, and the uncarved figure is the world, right? So what we have to imagine is that just like an uncarved pillar, you might say, contains all possible statues. We could carve an infinite array of different statues in there. In the same way, consciousness contains every possible world. And so this is giving you a sense of the universe the Mokṣopāya is painting, this kind of philosophical image. But before moving on to sort of the question I raised at the beginning of how this image gives us taste of liberation, let me just make the point that the size and scope of the Mokṣopāya's universe is alluded to in the story of the 100 Rudras, which we saw, right? So this happens at the end of the story, where Rama asks Vasiṣṭha whether the monk actually exists. Vasiṣṭha says he doesn't know, but eventually finds him when he flies through the space of consciousness. So we get a glimpse from this at how the reader of the Mokṣopāya is slowly brought through the course of the text to the realization that all of Vasiṣṭha's stories are true, simply because every possible imagination is true. There's no difference between imagination and reality, because reality contains all imaginations. This poetic world is slowly built up through the text as it progresses, and it culminates, I think, in this passage, where Vasiṣṭha sees the infinite array of universes with their infinite varieties of contents and structures. So, here we go. This is saying a bit more about that. So, let's return to this question: how does this radical worldview offer a taste of liberation? So, in my thesis, I argue that one thing the Mokṣopāya does is it doesn't just paint this picture, but it uses stories in a very particular way to actually get the reader to imagine that their world is just one world in this infinite array of universes. So I won't really go into this, but it uses things like fourth wall breaks. So the writer of the Mokṣopāya actually references Kashmiri, and he references the time of the text's own recitation, sort of breaking down this barrier between what the reader might think is the real world and just this imaginary world that the Mokṣopāya is painting, right? But then we have to ask, well, if somebody imagines themselves in the world of the Mokṣopāya, what difference will this make to their experience, right? You might say, well, surely it doesn't make any difference, right? The world that I experience it, because it's explained by this power of infinity, isn't actually distinguishable from the world. So the world, if this world appeared within the infinite series of worlds in the Mokṣopāya, how would it actually appear differently, right? But I think there's something interesting here. For me, when I imagine my world as the Mokṣopāya asks me to, I notice that it sort of takes on a different quality, right? That if I really sort of focus on this, if I imagine the world as a sort of spontaneous stream, my experience kind of shifts in a subtle way. So this shift doesn't motivate me to dismiss my experience as a sort of contemptible illusion, something that doesn't matter. Rather, it actually sort of, if you get into it, it kind of it heightens the vividness of my experience, right? So if I'm really in it and I'm really trying to immerse myself in the world of the Mokṣopāya, it allows me to sort of pay attention to the parts of my experience that I might normally ignore, right? So the droning of a fan in the background might become a bit louder, or the play of light in a library window might become more vivid. So how can I explain this? Well, I don't really want to jump all the way into Schopenhauer's aesthetic theory right now. But in my thesis, I use Schopenhauer to explain this effect that I'm trying to describe. And so I won't go into his philosophy in detail, but this quote, I think, is a really great summary of how Schopenhauer thinks the experience of art, the experience of seeing a work of art, is a really unique kind of experience, right? So let me just read a little bit of it. So he says that when elevated by strength of mind to stop viewing things in the ordinary way, no longer led by the forms of the principle of sufficient reason, which we don't have to worry about, to pursue merely the relations between things. If we stop considering the where, when, why, and wherefore of things, but simply and exclusively consider the what, if we do not allow our consciousness to become engrossed by abstract thinking, concepts of reason, but if instead of all of this we devote the entire power of our mind to intuition, and by intuition he just means experience, and immerse ourselves in this entirely, letting the whole of consciousness be filled with the peaceful contemplation of the natural object that is directly present, maybe it's a landscape, a tree, a cliff, or a building, or whatever it might be, he says that we lose ourselves in this object completely, right? So this is Schopenhauer's vision of how art works. And what's interesting about Schopenhauer is that he thought that this experience was possible, but he thought it was a fundamentally fleeting experience. For Schopenhauer, the paradigm example of experience of art happens in music. But music, of course, is fleeting. Music, every song comes to an end. And for Schopenhauer, who was sort of the archetypal depressive philosopher, who's a very depressed man, he thought that we have always plunged back into the world of suffering. But what I argue in my thesis is that what the Mokṣopāya offers is a way of imagining the world in which every experience can be this kind of aesthetic experience. The Mokṣopāya suggests another possibility by asking us to see every aspect of our waking life as an aesthetic encounter. So if we take on the Mokṣopāya's imaginative metaphysics, this world that I've described, then the apparent connection between experiences is ultimately coincidental. Things arise completely spontaneously within the space of consciousness. Although they seem to be, they're not ultimately dependent on any fixed causes, nor do they actually have a fixed location in time and space, nor are they the product of any kind of will. All things have only one why. There's only one real reason why things exist, and that is because they can exist, right? In the world of the Mokṣopāya, every possible imagined scenario is not only possible, but is actual. It actually exists somewhere in consciousness. And if we think about it, so in the world of the Mokṣopāya, if I drop this, there's a world in which this flies up into the sky. But we just happen to live in the world in which every time I drop this, it actually falls down. And it might seem completely unlikely, but if you actually think about it, if every possible world exists, then in this world, with all the things that have happened, all of its particularities, with me speaking to you today, not only might exist, actually has to exist if all possibilities exist. So it's not unlikely at all that this world as we experience it arises within consciousness. So if we imagine the world in this way, I think the Mokṣopāya allows us to see each event as it comes, in a way. To not ask the questions of what, where, why, and wherefore things arise, but to simply immerse ourselves in the moment, in the way things appear to us, right? So in this very paradoxical way, I think the Mokṣopāya is trying to bring us into a sense of what it's like to experience, to be completely immersed in the moment, to experience things as they come. But it does this by painting this image of the world as an infinite array of universes. So this is my sense of the Mokṣopāya's, the way that it gives this taste of liberation. And then there's a bit here about maybe some more complexities there, but I think I'll leave this for now, and then I'll just skip to my conclusions. So this is just a summary of where we've gone, right? So we can see that the Mokṣopāya doesn't just tell us about Jivan Mukti, it gives us a taste of Jivan Mukti. This is how the text is designed. And it does this by constructing a radical philosophy. And this philosophy is expressed partly explicitly, but it's also expressed through the stories. And we saw the story of the 100 Shivas. And this philosophy that the text creates is this philosophy of an infinite universe in which every possibility exists, in which every possible imagined scenario is in some way actual. And that actually, if we think about it, this philosophy of infinity can actually help us encounter the world in a more aesthetic way, to immerse ourselves in the moment, be sort of less stuck in our heads. So, thank you. That's my image of how the Mokṣopāya works. I hope it was enjoyable.
An aesthetic experience or not?
Okay.
I think it was. Can we have another round of applause? we are going to open up the forum to a short Q&A, which can last 15-20 minutes. So we'll start with some questions if you have any, please.
And if any...
Just wanted to ask you, are you actually saying that Jivan Mukti is really being really in the present? Because often where we live through our memories, don't we, or false imaginations of the future, that's what Krishna tells us in the Bhagavad Gita. He's saying just be present and be focused. Is that, yeah.
I think there's this verse in the Gita, I've forgotten it now. But Krishna tells Arjuna that the mind of the wise person is one-pointed, is eka, whereas the mind of somebody stuck in delusion is bahushaka, it has many branches. It's bahushaka hyanantascha, it's infinite and has many branches. So I think in the Gita there's this sense of what causes us suffering is the fact that we get lost in our minds. We get lost in all the different kind of infinite paths that our minds take us on. And that being able to be focused, to be one-pointed and to be in the present moment is ultimately what leads to freedom. And so, interestingly, I think the Mokṣopāya has a very different kind of philosophy. I mean, this world of all these different dream worlds is not something that you see in the Gita. But I think if we take a sort of step back and we look sort of more of a philosophical analysis, more sort of what's called a phenomenological analysis, we might say that, well, maybe the Mokṣopāya is using a different philosophy to point us in the same direction as the Gita. It's trying to get us to see, to immerse ourselves in the moment, to be less stuck in our heads. But it does this through painting this sort of fantastical vision of the world, which was never really taken seriously as an actual philosophical position. There was a lot of very serious philosophical debate in India, especially in medieval Kashmir. But the Mokṣopāya never became that kind of text. It never became like a shastra. It never had followers. So I think we have to see its philosophy as sort of literary, as trying to give us a different way of seeing the world. It's very, very Star Trek-y. Yeah. There's actually a recent film called Everything Everywhere All at Once, which I don't know if people have seen. I think the Mokṣopāya is painting an image of the universe that is exactly the same as that film. Is asking that in that film there's sort of infinite parallel worlds where everything you could imagine that could happen actually does happen somewhere. And the Mokṣopāya is saying that, well, maybe we can see the world in that way too. Yeah. Thank you.
Any more questions?
Sorry, just one more. Sorry.
Please.
And do you have to be like in a state of meditation to get the different, because I suppose I'm reading a book called Superconscious, where once you get into that real state of meditation, you can actually imagine different states and different futures, etc. So I just wondered,
Yeah, so I wonder, it's sort of unclear to me. My sense is the author of the Mokṣopāya is someone whose mind was coming from a slightly different place, I think. And I think he was writing, but he was also an incredibly intelligent, educated, well-trained in philosophy and aesthetics and poetry. So I think in a way he was trying to combine these two things and use all his sort of intellectual resources to create a poem that gave expression to kind of maybe where his meditation took him in some way. The Mokṣopāya, in a lot of the story, there's lots of characters who do sort of meditative techniques and then experience this kind of world of infinite realities. And so maybe it's coming from that place in him. But yeah, for me, I find it just interesting as a thought experiment. If we imagine the world in this way, if I imagine my world in the way that the text asks me to, it sort of brings me into the present moment in some way. No, please, yeah.
This is the last one. How does that sort of combine with quantum physics? Because the way you look is different to the way the book looks at you because of quantum physics.
I'm not an expert in any of that, really. There is something in quantum physics, so this is maybe not exactly your question, but there is something in quantum, there's sort of consensus over some mathematical equations, and the fact that these mathematical equations describe quantum phenomena in quantum physics, but there's lots of different interpretations of what those mathematical equations actually mean, right? And one famous interpretation is called the Everettian interpretation of quantum mechanics, which is actually popular by one famous physicist, or popularized by one famous physicist in Oxford. And the Everettian interpretation is this many worlds interpretation that people may have heard of, right? So it's this idea that every time there's a quantum event, the worlds kind of branch off, and so there's an infinite array of worlds. So in Everettian quantum mechanics, it actually envisions the universe as containing every possibility, right? There's all these different possibilities. But what's different is that in Everettian quantum mechanics, the only things that are possible are things that happen in accordance with the laws of nature, with the laws of physics. The laws of physics are ultimate, right? And that every possibility that can occur within the laws of physics can actually take place, and does actually take place. But for the Mokṣopāya, the world that Vasiṣṭha is painting is a world in which the worlds that appear aren't constrained by the laws of physics, they're only constrained by the imagination. So anything that you can even imagine as possible actually does appear. So it's a kind of infinitely larger infinity in a way. I think in a way that the metaphysical details of it, trying to defend the Mokṣopāya's philosophy sort of metaphysically, it seems sort of, the philosophy is too extravagant in a way, I think, to...
Can't be constrained.
Yeah. It seems, I think it didn't create a philosophical school in India, and I think that for good reason. People might see it as sort of absurd or something in a way. But I think the way to understand it is that, well, maybe it was a thought experiment. Maybe it was a way of thinking about what could be. And if we think about it that way, then maybe it sort of gives us a taste of a different state of mind. Yeah.
I'll be a bit provocative.
Please.
I think your philosophy is not an insight into liberation,
Uh-huh.
so much into chaos.
Uh-huh.
Because I'm saying if the aesthetic is that you can do anything and everything and imagine everything, why do we get trapped into narrow narratives which are the food of everyday life? I'm not saying you're wrong. I like your idea, but I'm still pulled into a particular narrow channel at the end of this chat. I can talk about it, but it's still part of this narrow memory-driven or narrative-driven story. And that is why people are reluctant to engage with this story. It's not complete for everyday action, for ethics or for behavior.
Yeah, no, it's great. I'm glad you asked that question. So there's sort of different levels on which I can answer that, right? At the beginning of the Mokṣopāya, it says that once you have reflected on what it calls dharmopāyan, so the means of dharma, which I think refers to the other great epics. It refers to the Ramayana and refers to the Mahabharata. Oh, sorry, not the dharmopāyan, the ghatopāyan, so the narrative, sort of the tool of narrative or something like that. So the text is basically saying that you should only read this text once you've reflected on dharma, once you've really mastered dharma. Once you've read the Ramayana and the Mahabharata and you're a person of dharma, then, and you've moved on to the next Purushartha, you've moved on to moksha, if you're interested in moksha, then you read this text. So that is maybe a caveat I should give at the beginning, that this paints a world in which of all possibilities, it seems sort of extravagant and abstract and irrelevant to daily life. And in a way it kind of is, but it's saying that once you're a person of dharma, once you've mastered that, then and you want to achieve liberation, then you move to this text. And interestingly, and this is sort of what I'm trying to get at with this kind of idea of infinity, right? That it paints this picture of the universe as absolutely infinite, as containing every possibility. But within that universe is the exact universe that you exist in right now, simply because it is one amongst that infinite set of possibilities. So even all of the sort of chaos of your everyday, all the particularities of your everyday experience, not only can exist, but has to exist in this kind of infinite ocean of worlds. So in a way, it's a way of recontextualizing our experience, even the mundanity, even the things that feel mundane, that feel boring, that feel sort of, they trap us, and maybe just, in the context of the Mokṣopāya, appearances within an infinite sort of play of consciousness. So that it's trying to use that to get a sense of like how we can feel liberated in the world while still being responsive to the needs of our moment and still sort of waking up and making the chai or whatever. So yeah.
Any more? So, may I ask a question?
Just a
Please.
Do you have an idea that this is written by one person or a group of people, or is it a school of people that have come together to put this text together? other?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I meant to mention that, but it seems like it's written primarily by a single person. So we don't know anything about this guy. There's an argument that I make in the thesis that the text actually may refer, so the author might refer to himself. At one point, the Vasiṣṭha says that the story that I am telling you will one day be recited in 10th century Kashmir. It doesn't say 10th century, but it says, which will one day be recited in Kashmir in the court of a king called Yashaskara by a minister called Narasimha. And so it seems that maybe Narasimha, this minister, may have actually been the writer of the text, and we can't confirm that. But actually, I make an argument that there's another philosopher in Kashmir that references someone called Narasimha, and that person he references is actually the author of the Mokṣopāya. So since Narasimha wrote this text, it's been edited, and the way that it works in sort of medieval India is that if someone writes a text, it gets copied by scribes. There was no sort of printing press. And that these scribes themselves may have changed bits. And so the text that we have now is definitely not the original text that Narasimha wrote. But it seems like the core of the text was written by one person. And we partly think that because there's stories like the story of 100 Rudras, but there's other stories that reference other stories in the text. So there seems to be a sort of cohesiveness to the text. The philosophy that you see in Book 1 is very similar to the philosophy you see in Book 6, across this huge sort of expansive verses. So, yeah, that's...
So are there different versions of the text, in libraries or...
Yeah. So, there's a really kind of interesting and long history of the way the text developed. It was first written in this sort of 30,000 verse form in Kashmir, and then it was condensed into something that is more commonly known as the Lagu Yoga Vasiṣṭha, so the smaller Yoga Vasiṣṭha, the lighter Yoga Vasiṣṭha, which is only around 6,000 verses. And then that was then sort of taken out of Kashmir, I think at some point in like the 14th century, or maybe earlier than that, in the 13th century. And that then became sort of incorporated into Advaita Vedanta tradition, and then that text was then compared, or some scribes found that small text, and then they found the bigger text, the Mokṣopāya, and they put them together and they created something new called the Yoga Vasiṣṭha, the Brihad Yoga Vasiṣṭha, the Great Yoga Vasiṣṭha. And that then becomes the text that becomes popular throughout India and is sort of printed in the 19th century. But beyond, so you have those three versions, but beyond those you have lots of different versions of the text as well. You have like really small condensed versions, you have versions in which just the stories, they take out all the philosophy, they just leave the stories. You have versions that take out all the stories and just leave the philosophy. Interestingly, it was translated to Persian by the Mughals. So it was a text that was of particular interest to the Mughal rulers of India. It was seen as a text of tasawwuf, of Sufism. And so it's had sort of lived many lives.
Are the philosophies from this text being taught in any schools at the moment?
Yeah, so it never created a school. It was incorporated later into the system of Advaita Vedanta. So it was seen as, the Yoga Vasiṣṭha was seen as a text that sort of teaches Advaita Vedanta. And in fact, if you look at some of the ways in which the Yoga Vasiṣṭha differs from the Mokṣopāya, it seems like the scribe wanted the text to be a text of Advaita Vedanta. So anything that looked like it was in opposition to Advaita Vedanta, they took it out. They take out sort of references to Buddhism. The text, for example, is really positive about the Buddha. It talks about the Buddha very highly, talks about Buddhism very highly, even if it uses a lot of Vedantic language. In fact, the author of the text at one point says that the truth that I am pointing to is what the Vedantins call Brahman, it's what the Buddhists call emptiness, it's what the Sankhya-vadins call Purusha, spirit, right? It's what the Vijnana-vadins call Vijnana, or consciousness. So you have a sense of this teacher, Narasimha, as somebody who was sort of, he knew all the different schools of his day, but he wanted to transcend them in some way. He wanted to create a philosophy that, in a way, points at the heart of all of the philosophies around him. And so because sort of, I think he was a bit of a maverick who didn't really ally himself with any schools and never created a school. Yeah. Thank you, question.
Okay, I have a question for you.
Please, Deepak.
So, at the beginning of your talk, you said that King Dashrath summoned Vasiṣṭha to pull Ram back from Vairagya.
Sure.
you know, after having been on this journey at a young age. And it clearly seems that the endless possibilities that this offers, this story offers, may have had an effect on Ram. So in later life, with all the vanvas and everything that went on, did Ram ever feel that he was conned into this whole trick?
Yeah, it's interesting. Interesting, like, in the context of the Ramayana, thinking about the Mahabharata. I don't know the Ramayana so well. But there's an interesting point, I think, my knowledge of the Ramayana is sort of failing. You know, Rama, through the whole, the Ramayana begins with this question. I think,
More about Gurmais,
it's more about,
the right thing to do.
yeah,
I always refer to it when it's to do with work stuff. You know, what's the
Yeah.
right thing to do?
yeah.
Has it changed your life, do you think? You were saying-
This text?
Yeah.
I love it now. I love it. Like, in a way, I love it more than when I first started. I don't know if it's changed my life, but
Do you
I-
think differently?
I'm not sure. I think about it a lot, and I really do feel like the author of this text was a genius, was a real poetic genius, that these stories have a real kind of aesthetic beauty to them that I find inspiring. And I think it's a shame that this text isn't sort of more widely known. But yeah, the beginning of the Ramayana, I think, asks the question, you know, who is the perfect person? Does the perfect person actually exist? And then the answer is Rama. And so, in a way, the whole Ramayana is built on this idea that Rama is the perfect person. So this text, you can see, is like the prequel to that. Like, how did Ram reach that stage of perfection? And he reached it by finding this Vairagya, but then also, you know, going further than Vairagya and sort of opening his mind in the way that Vasiṣṭha tells him to. So yeah.
Okay, so in conclusion, what you're saying is the possibilities are endless. Let's not give up hope. And who knows?
And who knows?
Who knows? what
Maybe
may
I'll drop
come.
this cup and it'll fly in the air. Or something.
Who knows? Yeah. Or
Yeah.
or that remarkable ends up in my bag.
Well,
Who knows?
We'll see. We'll see. Hopefully not that possibility.
Absolutely. Okay.
Thank
So,
you.
do we have any more questions? Okay. Oh,
So your conclusion was to approach this infinitesimal world in an artful way. Can you explain that?
Yeah. So this is this. It stems out of this idea, right? Of, well, if the Mokṣopāya is painting this picture of the universe, what does that do to the reader? We saw earlier on, right, that the text doesn't just want to tell us about Jivan Mukti, it wants to actually get us to experience Jivan Mukti in some way. And it clearly paints this picture of this infinite world. I think that's sort of undeniable if we read the text. So then we have the question, okay, how does this infinite world then actually get us to experience the world differently? And the way that I argue for that in my thesis is by using Schopenhauer's philosophy. And Schopenhauer describes the experience of art in this very particular way, right? And so he was sort of trying to express that in this quote through Schopenhauer's sort of difficult writing. But he sees the experience of art as this particular moment when we see a painting. The way I see it is the Mokṣopāya asks us to see the entire world in this way. You know, if everything that happens is completely random, then I can't take anything for granted. I have to sort of be completely present in the moment all the time. Right? It's like, you know, I might wake up in the morning and I'm sort of in my head and I think I know who I am and what the world is, and then I sort of reach for the coffee cup and the coffee cup isn't there, and suddenly I'm sort of snapped into reality, because in that moment my expectation, my sort of unconscious way of being in the world is broken, and I have this moment of sort of immersion in the world. I think the way the Mokṣopāya paints the picture of the universe is that everything is random, that we can't take anything for granted. And so it wants us to then see the world in this way all the time. You know, sort of, live in a state of wonder, of in constant wonder, I think. And the text uses this word chamatkriti, or wonder in Sanskrit, to describe, you know, how the Jivan Mukta experiences the world. So. Yeah, easier said than done, of course, but yeah.
so thank you very much again.
No, thank you so much for listening to me, I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
And we would like to have you back again.